Welcome back after spring vacation. 5 more weeks left of classes left in the semester, as best as I can count, and there's still a lot to do. Right now we're thinking about situations of inflation, having left off depressions and deep downturns like the one we're currently in, to try to give you more of a feel of what macroeconomics is and what can happen to macroeconomics. And right now, this part of the course, the economics of inflation and dealing with inflation, is in the United States at least relatively boring, because we have next to no inflation at all in the United States. Because if anything, our inflation rate is not too high but too low. But there have been periods in the past when figuring out how or whether to control or reduce the rate of inflation have been the most important economic policy issue of the day, and there may well come times in the future. There may well come times in the future where the same is the case. So that's why we're spending time on inflation economics in this course. First, over some logistics. Problem set 7 is due April 5th at 11 a.m., and I think I'll get through enough today that it'll actually be doable by next Tuesday. If not, I'll get through enough on Thursday, so the problem set is doable by next Tuesday. There was going to be an April 7th midterm exam, a second midterm, but after considerable thought about the first midterm and discussions between me and Dariush and so forth, I've decided to change the second midterm into a take-home assignment to be given out on April 14th, due April 19th at the start of class. And it should be, say, a 3-hour open book assignment, is my view, some problem solving and some essay writing. So it'll be a lesser time commitment than studying for the midterm would have been. Why am I doing this? Why I'm doing this is because there was a very large split on the midterm. That is, pretty much everybody had some idea or a good idea of what to do with the identifications. And pretty much everyone could write something coherent on the short answers. But on the numerical quantitative problems, about 2/3 of the class kind of got it, understood what they were supposed to do, and tried to do it. And to the extent that you got things wrong, that 2/3 to 3/4 of the class did so because of arithmetic mistakes, or because we were overly tricky and there were subtleties of the problem that you hadn't considered, or because there were actually 3 effects and you only found 2. The other quarter, maybe a third of the class, seemed not to have gotten it at all. So for April 7th, I'm going to take the class that was going to be the midterm and turn it into a general problems review. All the kinds of quantitative problems I'm going to expect you people to do on the final exam in one mad rush. And I think for those of you who did well or doing well on the problems in the problem sets and did well on the problems of the midterm, and you know who you are, this class will be optional. For the rest of you, it's, I think, an essential thing to come to given the likely form that the final exam is going to take. Unfortunately, cross-correlating exam grades on the one hand with iClicker attendance on the other, of the quarter of the class that really needs to come and pay close attention on April 7th, most of them aren't here. But we're going to try. And because I don't think I have time to give up another lecture for a circle back over the quantitative problems part of the course, because I really don't think I have time to do that. I don't want to lose another lecture. That's the reason I'm changing the midterm to a take-home assignment. That's the reason I'm changing the midterm to a take-home assignment that will not be on April 7th, but will begin on April 14th, and that will be due come April 19th. Nevertheless, just to get your juices flowing for April 7th, whether you're here or not, here are the problems that I want you to solve, or at least those that we've gone through so far. I want you to be able to tell me how much bigger is total world GDP now than it was 10,000 years ago. And let me cut this off since everyone's answered already. And yep, I want you to know that. And I want you to know what the unemployment rate is right now. Although I think we're going to get another alternative unemployment rate come Friday morning when they release the results of the survey taken in the week of the 12th of March. Okay. And yep, well, 9.4 was the unemployment rate a little while ago. It's still the seasonally adjusted unemployment rate, but I'm looking for the seasonally adjusted one. And let's skip Say's law since we've done that more than enough. The growth model questions. Right? The growth model questions weren't on the first midterm, but I'm somewhat worried about them because they are a little more complicated than some of the others, and performance on the problem set was a little substandard. So suppose you have a savings rate of 21%, and then investment requirements of N, G, and delta, population growth, efficiency of labor growth, and depreciation that add up to 7%. That's going to give you a capital output ratio of 3. You're then going to raise that to the power of 1 with your diminishing returns of 1/2. So then output per worker is going to be 3 times the efficiency of labor. And we're still not doing too well. We're still not doing too well on this. And I'd like you people to get better, albeit not under classroom conditions, but under test conditions. We have more time to think. Alternatively, the basic income expenditure questions. That is, you know what the flows of autonomous spending are. You know what the parameters determining the multiplier are. In this case, we're going to have a multiplier of 1.5 in this problem, because by the time you multiply the income by the amount that's left after taxes are taken out and multiply that by the marginal propensity to consume, you get that only about 60 cents of every extra dollar in income is spent on consumption. And then you subtract the propensity to import, and you get a multiplier of 1.5. And then with an autonomous spending of 8, that should give you with a multiplier of 1.5, an autonomous spending level of 8 gives you a level of real GDP of 12 trillion. That I'd like to see people doing better on. And then last, there's the investment savings version of the income expenditure model. That is, right now, the Federal Reserve is thinking of abandoning its quantitative easing policies. And if it abandons its quantitative easing policies, the general view is that long-term real risky interest rates, right, this delta R in this equation, is going to go up by 1 percentage point. What's going to be the effect of that on the level of GDP? Is that a good thing to do? The Federal Reserve is wondering about that right now. That's a good thing to be able to know how to calculate. And here I want the answer of C, 1.8 trillion. Is that what I want? Yes, that is what I want. 1.8 trillion. And I'm not getting it in large numbers. Now, you people did much, much better on the exam than you can do under these circumstances. But still, that's something that needs work. That's another reason to take April 7th and move it from an exam into a kind of problem-solving and problem-modeling exercise. So that's the end of the logistics. And now let me go back to the economics of inflation. That we had our consumer price index, say, rising by a factor of 10 or so since 1950. That $10 today buys about as much as $1 did in 1950. Of course, $10 a day buys you very different things than $1 bought you in 1950. Like I was listening to Columbia Business School professor Rick Mishkin, former Federal Reserve governor, yesterday. And Rick was talking on TV about how in his new house he has bought huge numbers of large screen TVs, enormous numbers of large screen TVs, like 1 or 2 for every room. Why? Because he said they were a lot cheaper than paintings. And if he was going to hang something on the wall, should he go and should he spend a fortune buying paintings to hang on the walls of what I presume is a relatively large house, or should he just buy a bunch of honking 60-inch TVs and then turn them either to the Nature Channel or to whatever scenes he likes to look at, suggesting that there is definitely a market opportunity up there for an art channel. The TV my parents bought in 1950, you couldn't buy a TV for, say, $400, a big screen, say, 50-inch projection or LCD TV now costs about $500. That's $50 back in 1950, according to the Consumer Price Index. You couldn't buy a TV for $50 back in 1950. You could maybe buy a TV for $1,000 back in 1950. What we buy now is very different than what we bought back then. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics has the job of figuring out what's happened to the average level of prices, and it's created this Consumer Price Index, which gives us our inflation rate, our post-World War II inflation rate, rising to a big peak during mobilization for the Korean War, rising to a secondary peak here during the Vietnam War. And back then, this inflation rate of almost 7% per year had people really, really, really worried. And of course, then came the tripling of world oil prices after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Then came the Iranian Revolution. Since then, the inflation picture has been much more mild. A big fall in inflation down to 1% per year during 1986 or so, when the Saudis decided they were going to cut the world price of oil by a factor of 3. A possible uptick of inflation in 1989 or 90 or so, after Alan Greenspan responded to the stock market crash of 1987 by saying, I need to make the money stock go faster. Maybe the stock market crash is going to produce a depression. Alan Greenspan was worried. He took lots of steps. It turned out not to be necessary. Instead, he pumped too much liquidity into the economy, and the inflation rate rose until he had to reverse course. And then there comes our current episode, when the Federal Reserve wishes that it had thought more about the oncoming depression, and when our inflation rate actually went negative for a few months as the level of employment in the economy collapsed. And I also talked last time about Okun's law, about the relationship between real GDP and the unemployment rate, and about how in those quarters or over those periods during which real GDP is growing very fast, unemployment falls, those periods where real GDP is growing slowly or shrinking, the unemployment rate rises, how we can generally move back and forth between changes in real GDP and changes in unemployment, and they're pretty much the same thing, right? That there's only one dimension of variation among those two variables. That you would generally have to keep track of one, but not of both, and depending on how we feel and what the issue is, we tend to look at one rather than the other. And that tells us that there's this nice relationship between the unemployment rate relative to the economy's natural rate of unemployment and the level of real GDP relative to the economy's level of potential output, to its sustainable productive capacity. And that means that an awful lot of the time we'll probably want to be looking at the unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate relative to the natural rate of unemployment is a good and stationary measure of how much slack there is in the economy or how much pressure there is in the economy, to what extent the economy is producing in a subnormal condition with lots of idle resources, or to what extent people are scrambling for resources and production is continuing at a level that's probably not sustainable. So from that perspective, when I'm focusing on the unemployment rate, we then had our idea of the Phillips curve. What is it that causes inflation to go up, right, or down? And we decided that inflation is in many ways a product of expectations, that the inflation rate is going to be what people expect it to be, plus a term, the magnitude of which depends on this slope parameter beta out in front on the last line, of this term beta times the difference between the natural rate of unemployment and the actual unemployment rate. When the actual unemployment rate is low, inflation is going to be running ahead of expectations. When the actual unemployment rate is high, inflation is going to be less than expectations. And this tells you two ways that a central bank like the Federal Reserve that wants to control inflation can actually act to affect it. The first is for the Federal Reserve to do what's called jawboning. That is, it uses its collective jawbone. It talks. It tries to convince people of what the future is going to bring and so of what their expectations of inflation should be. The second thing the Federal Reserve can do if jawboning doesn't work, and if inflation is still higher than it wants to see, is it can hit the economy on the head with a brick by raising the unemployment rate. Right? The Federal Reserve raises the short-term nominal interest rates it controls. That will raise long-term real interest rates. That will push down investment spending and exports. That, through the multiplier process, will push real GDP down. That will push the unemployment rate up. With businesses finding themselves lots of idle capacity in few markets, they won't charge high markups over costs. And with workers scared of losing their jobs because unemployment is high, they won't ask for wage increases. If the economy, or if the Federal Reserve hits the economy on the head with a brick by increasing interest rates and raising the unemployment rate, it can control inflation. It can bring inflation down pretty much no matter what else is going on in the economy. It may not want to, but it can. And so that's how we started thinking about inflation control, with this Phillips curve. And I'm going to want you to work on this Phillips curve for problem 7, right? For problem set 7. Right? That if the natural rate of unemployment is 5%, if the expected inflation is 4%, and if the parameter beta governing the slope of the Phillips curve is 1/2, and if the actual unemployment rate is 8%, what's the inflation rate going to be? What's expected inflation plus this beta term times the difference between the natural rate of unemployment and the actual rate of unemployment? Well, expected inflation is 4%. The actual unemployment rate is 3% higher than the natural rate, so that's putting downward pressure on inflation, pushing it below expectations. The parameter is 1/2, so 3 times 1/2 is 1.5. So the inflation rate will be 1.5 percentage points below what people had previously expected. People had expected 4%. So what we have is 2.5%. people are getting the sign wrong. That is, when the unemployment rate is high, the inflation rate is going to be low. Yeah? That's very fuzzy. It's everyone's expectation. And it's something that's formed over a considerable period of time. Right now, my wife and I are paying an interest rate on our home mortgage that we took out 15 years ago. And it's true that that interest rate has bounced around a bit. It floats a little bit. But by and large, when we were making our economic decision to buy the house 15 years ago, we were thinking, what's the inflation rate going to be over the next 30 years? And because we locked in a contract back then, what we expected inflation to be 15 years ago still enters into the market's expectation of inflation today, because a whole bunch of economic decisions that affect current economic activity were made 15 years ago. They still apply today, and they were kind of set in stone. So expected inflation, it's very much an average of all the expectations that people have held into the past, taken at the time they were taken, to the extent that they still affect what's currently going on in the economy. That is, Berkeley adjusts professors' salaries to inflation rather slowly. So I'd say that the expectation of inflation that dominates in our professorial contract negotiations with the university is kind of formed about 5 years ago. That what we're currently being paid now depends on what we thought inflation would be 5 years ago. Alternatively, a whole bunch of things depend on what people thought inflation would be last year, or what it would be a month ago, especially the volatile food and energy prices, which bounce around an awful lot most of the time. Yeah? Right, yeah. Job owning. Try to convince people that there isn't going to be any more inflation. The classic example comes from Weimar Germany in 1923 and 1924. You see, at the end of World War I, the old German semi-dictatorial authoritarian empire was overthrown by a bunch of liberal social democrats who established a German republic and who promptly asked for an armistice and said we should not continue this incredibly stupid war. Here we are. We're no longer the militaristic authoritarians who used to run Germany. We're good liberals. Let's be friends. Especially as President Woodrow Wilson had in fact said that he wanted to end World War I with a peace without annexations or indemnities. That is, he wanted the settlement of territory after the war to be done on rational principles, rather than that we get this province because we won, and that nations start over in a friendly fashion, rather than you lost the war, you now have to pay us a huge fortune because you lost the war, as Germany had demanded in 1871 after its victory over France in the Franco-Prussian War. Unfortunately for the future of Europe and the world, the politicians who governed France and Britain then, David Lloyd George in Britain and Georges Clemenceau in France, they promised their people, well, that if you win the war, everything will be a lot better. You won't have to pay for the war. The Germans, they burned northern France to the ground and shelled it for 4 years and dug trenches throughout it. They'll have to pay to rebuild it. You Britons, you've been taxed to the gills and nearly starved to death for 4 years because of submarines sinking ships bringing food to the island. When the war is over, all of a sudden your tax burden will go way, way down, and there'll be a lot more resources to build a land fit for heroes. So what Woodrow Wilson and the German representatives believed that they were there at the Palace of Versailles to set up a League of Nations and establish a regime of world peace was outweighed by Clemenceau and Lord Lloyd George's belief that Germany had to pay a fortune after the war. But they said, well, these are indemnities. We're not asking Germany to pay us money because we won. We are just asking for reparations. We're just asking for Germany to repair the damage it did. And, of course, Clemenceau and Lloyd George had an extra lever to use over Woodrow Wilson because British and French governments had borrowed an absolute fortune from American investors during World War I. They'd issued a huge amount of war bonds, and American investors had bought a huge amount of them as a good investment. And Britain and France said no reparations, no repayment of war bonds. If you won't make Germany pay to repay the damage it's done, then we won't pay your investors back the money they loaned to us. We'll simply default. And so when the Treaty of Versailles is signed in 1919, it comes with a huge, enormous financial burden placed on Germany, that it is supposed to pay an enormous amount of money each year for the next 30 years back to Britain and France, some of which they would then pass on to the United States, to repair the damage done by World War I. And the Germans didn't like this, especially even the German liberals now running the Weimar Republic didn't like this, if only because the conservatives began saying, well, if we hadn't overthrown the emperor would have gotten us better terms at the peace treaty, and it's only these November criminals who have agreed to impoverish us for generations by paying reparations. So the German government is faced at the end of World War I with the requirement that it pay lots of money, and it doesn't want to raise taxes to do so. So it starts printing money. Right? It simply says, we're not going to collect extra taxes, we're just going to print up extra banknotes and use them to fund government spending. And as the supply of banknotes grows, people notice and people begin to expect inflation, and inflation takes hold. And then come 1923, the French government gets angry because Germany isn't making all its reparations payments on time, and so they send the French army into Germany to say, we're going to take over the western provinces of Germany, and we're going to collect taxes, and simply transfer them back to France. If the German government won't collect taxes to pay its reparations, we will. At which point the German government calls for passive resistance and a general strike against the French occupiers, and says, oh, by the way, and no German is going to be hurt by the fact that you're now on a general strike. We, the German government, will pay your wages and salaries, while you're following this policy of passive non-cooperation with the French, and they start printing more and more and more money. So that at the peak of the inflation in late 1923, before World War I, it had taken 4 German marks to make a dollar. A German mark was worth 25 cents in the U.S. By 1923, it takes 4 trillion German marks to make a dollar. And at the end of the hyperinflation, prices are increasing at the rate of 15% per day. Right? That each day the prices you have to pay are on average 15% higher than the prices that you had to pay the day before. And the German government has tried to stop this hyperinflation many, many times by late 1923. And then toward the end of 1923, they hit on an expedient that works. They simply say, forget your old currency. The old currency is completely worthless. We're going to start a new currency. It's not going to be the old imperial mark. It's going to be the new Rentenmark. It's going to be something that's based not on how much money we've printed, but instead it's going to be